Hey there, everyone. I'm Raymond Lee, the host of Clocking Out. This podcast, it was born from a deeply personal place. Like many of you listening, I've experienced those moments where you look at your career and you think to yourself, there has to be more than this. Those crossroads we all experience, they're hard. We tend to stay safe, feeling stuck, then taking that leap of faith. Clocking Out is dedicated to my mom, who showed me what courage really looks like when she took her own leap of faith to pursue career fulfillment. Her journey inspired me to find my own career path and now to create this space where we can explore other people's stories together. My hope here is that our guests might illuminate something in your own path, whether you're contemplating a major change or you're just simply looking for more meaning in your work. Either way, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Today, I'm incredibly grateful to welcome Simon Rinne to our Clocking Out community. Simon's from down under in Australia, and his journey is quite special because May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and at an early age, he experienced mental health, but he really didn't know what it actually meant. But years later, after experiencing anxiety and stress at work, it became apparent to Simon, and it was later diagnosed. In this episode, Simon shares his emotional story of dealing with the lifelong disease of mental illness to breaking free and launching a company dedicated to helping people cope with their own mental struggles. So without further ado, please enjoy Simon Rinne and his Clocking Out story. Simon, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too, Raymond. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. For some context purposes here, you and I connected several months ago now, and I was looking at your background, and I think the timing of our conversation today is so perfect because, we're just a couple of days from May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And in the timing of our conversation and the work that you're doing for the last few years is just impacting so many lives. And so really excited to share with our listeners your journey and your clocking out moment where you left a very stressful career to pursue this passion. And so the timing of our conversation, I believe, is very perfect. And I'm looking forward to jumping in and getting to know you a little bit more.
Yeah, we're happy to explore all of mental health. Mental health is my jam, and as we'll find out later on, that is what I do as a career now. Hasn't always been the case, so it's good to be stepping into this space authentically with the mask off and just having a really candid conversation about all things mental health.
Yeah, I love that. So Simon, our listeners love a good origin story, and what I'd like to do is share with us where you're from. Where'd you grow up? What'd your parents do for a living?
Yeah, well, as you can tell, I'm not from the US, from down under. So I grew up in a place called Adelaide, which is in South Australia. So if you think of the map of Australia, it's in the middle, down the bottom. So the northern suburbs of Adelaide in the 80s and 90s was working class. It was, let's say, lower socioeconomic as well. So mum was a cleaner, for example. Dad worked at the local council. Dad had a pretty good job. He had gone to night school to get the qualification to do the work that he did. But yeah, certainly not rich in our family, working class. Everybody we knew were in the same bucket. And even like the schools that I went to, they were just the local state schools that weren't expensive to get into or anything like that. Grew up with three brothers, so very masculine household, and we played a lot of sport. So Aussies love our sport, and we played Australian rules football, which is like NFL but without the pads, basically. And so we lived and breathed that. We did it all the time. Every time you saw us, we'd have a football in our hands, we're kicking it, we're watching WCW and WWF wrestling on Saturday afternoons when that was on as well. We were watching things like the Terminator, Die Hard, Rambo movies. So very hyper masculine household. I feel sorry for my mum because she had to bear that all.
Yeah, that's so cool how you're kind of describing, I love the the reference of watching a lot of those American movies, The Terminator, and, just constantly playing sports. I wonder, Simon, when you were young growing up, what did you want to be? What were your dreams of how you envisioned your life was going to look?
Yeah, this is a great question. I always said to my mum that I wanted to be a comedian. I always thought of myself as a bit of a larrikin, someone telling jokes, always laughing, smiling, which was interesting because of the internal discourse that was happening as well, which is very different to the external, presentation that I had.
Mm.
As school progressed, I wanted to, I think, play Australian rules football like most young fellas, my age, and in our area. I wasn't really 100% committed to doing the work for that though. And it did become a bit of a chore, so that kind of waned over the years as well. There was no real solid idea of what I wanted to do. But I do know as I got towards the end of high school, experiencing mental ill health for a long time, but still not knowing what it was because it wasn't diagnosed, I just said to myself, I want to work with people just like me. Now, I didn't know what that meant. And to this day, it took a long time to find out what that meant. So I landed on anthropology, and I didn't really know what that was, but it sounded cool. It was study of culture, study of the way society interacts with it, which I found kind of interesting. But again, it was like, you do that, but what do you do after high school, like after university? So it ultimately led to one career choice that I had, which was at the end of uni, I typed into, I think it was an AOL search engine, which we haven't used here for decades. And I said, what does a social scientist do with an anthropology major? The only jobs that were coming up was in the public service. So to join a graduate program in a government agency, and that was it. And I still didn't even know what all that meant as well. And
So going back though to your dad's career, what did you think about his career? Because it sounds like you sort of gravitated to government agencies once your career started to flourish. And I wondered if there was any sort of connection from the work that he was doing that almost maybe inspire is a strong word, but was relatable to taking what you learned from school and applying it to government agencies.
it's a now that we pointed out, like I remember I did in year 10. We had to do work experience, and we had to go find a local business to do work experience where we rock up for a week in like dress shoes, shirt and all this stuff, which is not me at all. And Dad said, I'll come and do it at my work. So I went to his work and for a week, and it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done, having to sit in an office. And I'm a year 10, so I'm like in my early teens, mid-teens, like can't sit still for 5 minutes, and having to be really quiet and do things like create folders and do printing and copying and photocopying and all that type of stuff. But I guess I could see him in an office environment. And so I'm like, okay, is this what a career is? Is this like you work in an office? Because I didn't want to work in a trade. I didn't want to be a mechanic, for example. I was doing a bit of after school work at a mechanics workshop, picking up their tools and cleaning up their mechanic spaces. I'm like, oh, that's not for me. I didn't want to do anything that my friends were doing, working in the car manufacturing plant. And I remember actually when I picked social science, I had two options. I had social science, and I thought maybe that can get me some sort of office job, and that would be like lead to that Australian dream of having a $50,000 a year job, eventually have a family, buy a house, that kind of thing. Alternatively, I was also accepted into a visual arts degree, and I'm thinking that really, I really liked that. I really enjoyed art. It helped calm the anxiety in my brain, which at the time I didn't know was anxiety. It helped slow everything down, and I felt good when I finished a piece of art. But in my mind at the time, I'm like, well, how is that going to earn me money? I don't know how you would make money as that kind of career. So I think maybe that experience with dad and dad having that office job and seeing mum work hard as a cleaner and the impact that had on her body, I think that might have persuaded me to opt for the office style career pathway, the safe option, I guess you could call it. And I guess here we are today, having made that decision and experiencing that over 15 years after university as well. So I never really thought about it like that, but maybe, yeah, his career did influence me in some way. I certainly didn't want to work at the local council, but, ultimately ended
Yeah.
up at a different version of government.
Yeah. Well, I looked at the five or six different stints that you've done since college, and I see a common thread there. And I do think that your parents, while they may not have a direct influence and say, I want you to do this, or I encourage you to do this, or have you thought you'd be great at this? Just sort of you growing up and seeing them working and maybe going to the office or hearing about work, you sort of start to connect dots later in your career. And so tell me about how you ended up in the first job that you were in as a result of your, sort of social sciences anthropology degree.
It was very weird. So these three government jobs came up and they were all interstate. So I'd never lived out of home. I was still living at home when I'd finished university. I'd never really been interstate in Australia. I'd been maybe once to Victoria, which is across the border. But everything in terms of the Australian public service, so our federal system, a lot of it's based out of Canberra, which is in a different state as well, and it's in the ACT. And I applied for three jobs, one being in immigration, which eventually I did get to, but down the track. Another one, I can't remember where that was. I think it was like defence or something, that sounded really interesting. And then the last one was in this really broad government department that had like 5 portfolios wrapped up together, and they didn't seem to mesh. So one was communications, one was information technology, one was the arts, and one was sport. And I'm like, well, I love sport and I like art, so maybe this is where I'm meant to be. So I applied for that one, and somehow, I don't know how it happened, because I applied for it and then I got accepted for an interview for that particular one. I went to the interview. I had no real life experience. I mean, I worked at a local hardware store at the time. I couldn't really say, this is the transferable skill sets. I think I swore halfway through the interview as well. Like, I didn't really know what I was doing. And then I heard nothing, literally for months. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I just didn't get it, whatever. And then it was around Christmas time, and I was house sitting my brother's house, and I was just checking my email, and I got an email from this graduate program saying I'd been successful and we'll see you in 3 weeks in Canberra. And I'm like, what the hell? How did this even happen? And they had the salary on there, which was that $50,000 mark. I'm like, wow, I'm just being offered a job in the middle income age bracket, or wage bracket, in another state, in a department I have no knowledge about or anything like that, and someone picked me, and I felt ecstatic. Like, it was an amazing feeling. And they were going to pay for everything for me to ship everything over to Canberra. I packed up my little 2-door car when it came time, and it was full to the brim of all the possessions I had, which wasn't very much, and drove across about 16 hours to get to Canberra. And I'd never been to Canberra before. I didn't know anyone there. But luckily I was there with, I think, 12 or 15 other graduates. So we had a program there and we had lots of support. They gave us some accommodation for a few weeks so we can get settled in, and then we can find our own place. So not only do I experience moving interstate, but moving in with housemates that I've never done that before, trying to figure out life. How do I set up bills, pay bills, be independent from family? How do I live in a place where I have no supports? All of my social structures were in Adelaide. It was a really surreal experience. And I ended up staying in Canberra for about 2 or 3 years. And ultimately met my wife there. She was doing a similar program, but in another government department, and we happened to cross paths about 12 months after I started there. So it was really surreal and a unique experience, and I guess set me up to, I guess, for the career pathway that I did have in the public service, but also where I ended up now out in private practice too.
Mhm. Interesting. So I wonder, like, that is such a big move, going 16 hours across country. And you described a little bit about some of the anxiety things that you were kind of struggling with your upbringing and presumably through college. And I wonder how scary that was for you to leave home and go somewhere where you essentially don't know anyone and you're starting anew. You hear about these kids who get scholarships and they leave home and go far away to college or even take a new job somewhere. And were you apprehensive about your ability to adjust and be successful?
No, not at all. I think the first 6 months was pure excitement. It was just exciting. It was different. It
Mhm.
was new. It was a breath of fresh air, a different city and a different state. Because I'd only ever really experienced the northern suburbs of Adelaide, so it was refreshing. It was exciting. I think as the year went on, though, like the anxieties and the depression and all that started to escalate. But again, I didn't know what these were because I hadn't been diagnosed. And I remember that Christmas, after so I'd been there for almost 12 months then, and I'd just moved into my own unit after house sharing for most of the year. And all of a sudden, like the pennies was really starting to pinch. Like I was really struggling financially in terms of outside of my the rent and the car payments that I was making. I didn't have much left over, and so I made the decision to move out into my own unit, which just I think made things worse. And I couldn't afford to go back home to Adelaide for Christmas, which is in Canberra. It's a very transient population. Most of people that work in Canberra aren't from Canberra, so during holiday seasons they all go out, and so there's a big, I guess, a migration of people moving out of the city. And so all the friends and the graduates that I had been partying with and hanging out with on weekends and doing work with, they weren't there anymore. And so I was just stuck in Canberra by myself. And it was one of the most incredibly loneliest times of my life. And it was that moment that I'm like, okay, this is actually a bit harder than I thought it was going to be. And
Mm.
it took about 12 months. And that moment of being lonely, dealing with Christmas by myself, stuck in this unit which had hardly any furniture, had hardly any food in the fridge, worrying about money, about income, and actually looking forward to going back to work in the new year, even though I hated my job at the time, because I felt like there was
Mhm.
some social connection there as well. So that was all happening. So it took, probably about that 12 months to get to that point. And then from there, you know, other things happened as well that unraveled and made me more starting to become aware of my mental health more obviously as well.
So Simon, you shared how it took 6 months, like the first 6 months, it was like this euphoria. You loved the new area. You had this group of new friends, and it sounds like over time you just started to dislike the job more and more. And you sort of started to connect this idea of these feelings and emotions being, something that is not right. Like you started to realize that there's, mental health issues that you are starting to experience, but you're connecting to. But there was another career pivot that you made, which is in the same industry. And would you say that the changing of jobs masks some of those mental health issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, probably 6 months. Well, I would say even earlier than that in that first year. So my first, I guess, rotation through this big government department was in the telecommunications field, and I remember having a lot of challenges with my manager. And the challenges were that like he would ask me to do something, but I didn't quite understand like how to write this report that he wanted. And we ultimately rewrote the report about 10 times to the point where we got to the end of the 3 months. And he's like, Simon, you haven't achieved anything. I'm like, well, I don't know what you want me to do. I've tried and tried and tried my best in this field that I have no knowledge about or interest in. And we're stuck at day one. So at this moment, I'm starting to question, is this the place for me? My second placement was in another similar section, but we were doing a slightly more interesting work. So we're looking at things like internet security and stuff like that. So I could do a bit of policy work there, and I can write up, what we call ministerial representations, which is you write into a minister for parliament and you get someone like me writing a letter in response, and then if they're happy with it, they'll sign it and off it goes in the mail. So that was different and made me go, okay, maybe I can do this thing. Maybe it's a bit more interesting. My third rotation, with the hope that my third one might be in sports, because I love sport, didn't happen. But I ended up in the arts portfolio, working at a museum, which was very different to the first two rotations, and made me feel a bit more excited about the public service, because I was working in an old museum in the marketing section. We'd do ghost tours at night time, which was really exciting. We'd work with the local radio station to drum up marketing for this museum, which was really cool. At the end of that, we get offered a permanent job if we're good enough. And the whole year, actually, I was in the back of my mind is, am I good enough for this? Is this the right thing for me? Am I going to pass or fail? And I always feared failure. And when anything like failure related would happen, I'd get a lot of anxiety. And this actually probably stems back from playing sports, playing football, because if we played a poor game or we misbehaved at training, Dad would be really hard on us and say, you don't mess around, you're there to play. You don't messing around with your mates, you're listening to the coach, you're doing what they say. And we had to be perfect on the footy field. And that also translated to other sports we played, athletics, basketball, you name it. And I carried a bit of that into my career, and I felt like I wasn't perfect and I wasn't good enough. And over that 12 months, the anxiety would go up and down depending on which placement I was in. I'd put a lot of pressure on myself to be the great, and ultimately to get to the end of that 12 months and get offered a full-time job somewhere. I got offered the full-time job, but in an area I absolutely had no idea about and hated. Absolutely hated. In fact, the first day I rocked up to that particular role, the manager said, "Oh, who are you?" And I'm like, I got this letter saying I'm meant to start here today. And he's like, "Oh, we were expecting somebody else, but you can stay if you want." And so I stayed, and they tried to give me some work that I had no idea about, and they wouldn't train me properly in it. And I stayed there for about 2 weeks or so, 2-3 weeks. And then I got this email from another graduate friend of mine who'd moved over to the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority and said, "Hey, we're looking for somebody else. Does anyone want to come across?" And I said, "Yes, take me, please." I begged them to take me. And making that move across was really exciting again. It was something that I was actually wanting to do. Sport, love sport. And we're talking about protecting the elite level of sport in Australia. I think we're coming into the Commonwealth Games or the Olympics in the next 12 months as well. So there was a big rush there in that agency to be protecting sport, doing lots of tests, making sure that no one's doping or anything like that. And that alleviated a lot of that stress and anxiety I was feeling, because it was new again. I was like, oh, yeah, this is awesome. But it's also probably one of the first times I've experienced high, I guess, key performance indicators and having to be the best. And so it was probably like as the first signs of stress for me in a workplace. The other placements were more anxiety, but this is the first time I experienced stress and going, am I out of my depth here? Do I know what I'm doing? Can I do this job? And I remember actually, this is the first time I've remembered this actually for a long time, is sitting down with my manager, and I just burst out in tears. And he's like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I said, "I just don't feel like I'm good enough." He said, "You're doing an amazing job. You don't see it." And I wiped away those tears. I buried those tears like most men do. It's the first time I've ever done that, actually. I've completely forgot about it until now. and that reassured me for a little while, but I always felt like there was a monkey on the back, like I could be doing better compared to the person sitting next to me.
Mm.
So again, it started manifesting, the anxiety started manifesting again in the form of stress. But I still loved that job, and I moved into a different role in that agency as well, and really loved that and loved being there. And I felt like I was part of a greater purpose, whereas that first 12 months in this other big department, I just felt like a cog in this massive wheel that was moving around. So it was exciting, but also masked again, over
Wow.
time.
That's so interesting. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about this idea of anxiety and stress and how the work environment that you had where you didn't feel valued as an employee and the managers made it very uncomfortable for you. And I can imagine your reaction to that was just high levels of anxiety where you just didn't even want to go into the office or didn't want to go to work. But then you get this opportunity to work in the anti-doping section of this agency, and the level of work and the excitement was so interesting, but then the opportunity was so big that it created a certain level of stress because you didn't feel capable or worthy of the job, then the stress started to mount because of your sort of lack of confidence in your ability to do the job. And it's just interesting how those two sort of reactions, how you sort of managed through that. And then ultimately that led to you making another change.
Yeah, we did. So during that second, I guess, part of the career in Asada, I met my now wife, and she's from a little place called Hobart in Tasmania. So that's another state right down the bottom. It's the bottom island of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Very cold climate, yeah, and after about 2 years, like we'd moved in together, and finances seemed a bit easier because all of a sudden I had someone to share, renting and so forth. She was getting a bit of cold feet and wanted to go back home to Tasmania. And I thought, you know what? Let's do it. Like, whatever. Like, the only thing I couldn't do was take my job with me, though, because there was no office down in Tasmania for the work that I did in Asada. So yeah, she managed to transfer. I started another job in a different type of government, which was interesting because it reported up to the premier. So I guess in Australia, when we have state government, the top person is the premier, much like the president is the top person in the US federal government. The prime minister is the top person in Australian federal government. So I had a very direct line up to senior management in that department. But again, had a terrible experience with a manager, a really terrible micromanager who would email us at 2 o'clock in the morning with demands. And I remember at the time I had a shoulder reconstruction surgery from an old football injury. I can finally afford this now. I'll go do this. I've got some sick leave and I've got some pay behind me. And I came back from, the recovery for that is about 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how the surgery goes. And I came back after about 4 weeks, and she would tell me that I wasn't working fast enough, even though my arm was in a sling and I was working left-handed, and I'm a right-handed kind of guy. So that was a good 6 months of enduring a really toxic manager in that role, and again had me questioning, was this the right move? What's going on? Like, I was already feeling a bit lonely in Hobart because I didn't know anybody outside of my wife and her family, and that compounded things. So I started looking for another job again shortly after that experience, which was a big change. There was a big change going in terms of culture, in terms of workplaces. Regret almost leaving Asada because it was such a cool job and I loved it, but also fitting into this new life of what would ultimately become my marriage as well. So it was an interesting dynamic in that first year down in Tasmania.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I was just thinking back to how in the last job you were feeling the stress and your manager asked what was wrong, and you started to be vulnerable and share a little bit of your feelings, and And I guess I'm comparing to this role with this next manager where you came into, like, you had this surgery and you're back at work, and you're looking for a little empathy, and I just wonder, for someone who's opening up and sharing their feelings in the workplace, like you were being your authentic self, you weren't getting the kind of um, support that you were looking for.
It was an interesting period because that first time when I was at Asada and I had that little breakdown, I call it little because it was very much like a minute and then I stopped myself. It was the first time I'd ever expressed any emotion to anyone. And for that manager to say it's okay, like you're doing a good job, like reassuring, like that was like, okay. But then I bottled it up straight away and it felt uncomfortable because I'd never done that before. And it was not something that I was used to and it wasn't something that was encouraged. So I guess to backtrack, part of the story that is untold so far at the moment is where I grew up and in the era I grew up with, nobody talked about mental health. And it was the mentality that boys suck it up, be a man, don't cry, don't show emotion. And so I think it was uncomfortable for me in that moment because it was the first time I did that and I did it unexpectedly. It just came up. I'm like, oh, this is a bit weird. I haven't had this emotion before, or at least not with somebody else. Maybe I have had it privately, but not with somebody else. And so when we moved down to Tassie and Hobart, and then I was experiencing this other section, I really just bottled everything up again. I put the brick wall back up. There was no emotion. It was just like, what is going on? Feeling a lot of regret and internal loneliness, but not verbalizing that. I was probably showing it in drinking. So it was around this time that my alcohol consumption really went from just every now and then, it was for a social thing, to more frequently. And my wife started to notice it. And she's like, Simon, you notice you're drinking a bit more. You're not the kind of happy-go-lucky kind of guy that I met. You're a bit more reserved. You're quiet. You're drinking a lot. And I didn't put two and two together. It took a long time for me to put two and two together. So I kind of try to mask it that way with alcohol. In saying that, on the other flip side of that, it was also exciting because it was a new city. We moved again, so there was an element of excitement there, and I think that carried me a long way. But it was interesting with that manager in that role is it got to a point where I couldn't deal with it anymore, and I'd never done this before, and I think it reminded me of that very first manager I had in that first graduate position who I just didn't get along with, and we kept going around in circles and around in circles. And I said to my wife, something's got to change. And the other team members that I was working with, they were like tiptoeing around this manager. And I'm saying, like, why hasn't anyone stood up for yourselves? Like, why? Like, this isn't right. And I've never done this before, but I wrote on a piece of paper all these dot points about what my concerns were with how she was managing the office. And after a couple of days off, because I was taking stress leave, I went back to the office and I said, can I have a meeting with you, please? And she said, yeah, come through. Because she was very, almost like passive aggressive, like very happy to your face, but behind your back would stab you like in a heartbeat. And I sat down and I started to read off this piece of paper and she tried to jump in over the top and defend herself. And I said, look, I'm really sorry, but I really just need to go through these dot points. I did it in a really calm way, and I went through all these dot points on this piece of paper. And at the end, she didn't really say much. She said, Simon, thank you. Let me think about what we've talked about. Interestingly, after that day, she went on sick leave for a prolonged period of time and ultimately resigned from that position.
Wow.
And I think what that did was it highlighted that it may have been time for her to go anyway. She'd maybe been in that role for too long, or maybe that it just wasn't right for her in that environment.
That is so interesting, and I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing those stories. What's interesting is I was looking at the various jobs, and from the sports anti-doping position, fraud analyst, inspector for border force and control. And what's really interesting, this common thread is like you were immersed in just incredibly stressful situations where you're sort of investigating bad actors in terms of you're looking for people who are cheating the system in some
Mm.
degree. And I was, as I was preparing for our conversation today, I wondered how much of that caused stress, like underlying stress, because it's like each of those jobs, with the result of that you were trying to uncover was incredibly negative, really. Like
Mm.
you're
Mm.
exposing a negative behavior and then applying some kind of penalty to that, whether they're kicked out of sports or they're going to spend time in prison. And I just wonder if there's any connection that sort of exacerbated your mental health situation that ultimately caused you to say, I got to do something else.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So certainly, sports anti-doping was the role to find fraudulent behaviour or unruly behaviour or behaviour that was going to cheat the systems. That was my role, was to detect that. Eventually we did make another interstate move during that process from Tasmania up to Queensland, where we now live. This time I was able to transfer my work, which was good, and so was Rachel. But that's when I stepped into a compliance monitoring role of businesses who would sponsor a foreign migrant to come to Australia and work in a role. And there's a lot of fraud in that area. So people that would pay $50,000 for a visa but never rock up to work. Or people that would come into the country and be offered a job, say, for $50,000, but then get underpaid pretty badly as well, so exploited. So my role was to investigate that kind of conduct around Queensland. Bit of time in immigration detention centres. So in the political space, over that period as well, there was a big push to stop the boats from Indonesia to Australia and to stop, essentially refugees coming in, because they were high cost to the Australian economy. And then if anyone knows Australian politics, we had this offshore processing regime where we'd send people to different countries rather than allowing them to settle in Australia. So I spent time in some of the refugee detention centres where we'd have people in detainment. Again, a compliance and fraud style role. Even though I was a logistics officer, I was moving refugees around the country and internationally as well. So a lot of that really interesting stuff. But as you said, it was always seeing the negative in people.
Mm-hmm.
Always. And it did get to a point through that career where I started questioning, I'm so sick of this. Like, all I see is the negative. I go out to my local restaurant and I feel like everyone's just being dodgy. Even I'm there not for work, I'm there for dinner. And so this started me questioning what's going on here. Now, it's interesting, during this period is when I got diagnosed with my mental health. So it was right at the start of immigration. I did go see a psychologist for mental health. I said, look, I think I'm struggling with depression. Got the diagnoses for depression, got diagnosed with anxiety, got diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. And turns out I'd been living with all those since I was 8 years old and masking it very well. It was really internalized. I did a lot of behaviors internally, but also in secret that nobody ever saw. So when I say behaviors, I guess OCD is the most prominent for me. So it's like a lot of checking behaviors, feeling unsafe and insecure in myself and my surrounds. They carried through me throughout my career and even today as well. But I mastered it all. So I'd be at the workplace, for example, checking in with people to make sure that I'm doing a good enough job, or that they like me still, or I check an email that I've sent, thinking that when I press send, it magically the words changed, and then I became offensive to someone and I was going to get in trouble. So I'd recheck emails 10 times after I've sent them. Things like that, little quirky things like that I never really understood until the diagnosis came, and then I started exploring what is mental health. But it was once I was diagnosed that I was able to start critically reflecting, going, okay, this is not right. I don't want to work in this negative environment anymore. And ultimately that did lead to a point where I'm like, you know what, I want to try something different. And it's at that point where I'm like, you know what, a long time ago I told myself I want to work with people just like me. I now know that's someone in the mental health field. And that's when I started exploring what other career options were available to work maybe in the mental health space as well. But it came after years and years and years of seeing the negative in people and getting really tired of that, and I guess the impact on my own mental health as well.
Wow.
But then having experienced all that, both within a very private space, so the 20 years of silence, but then also in the professional space, I'm like, okay, well, I've experienced both private mental health, but also mental health in the workplace. I had a bit of an understanding of maybe how I could help other people as well. But it ultimately led to what's called burnout in 2020. Where the prolonged chronic stresses of trying to deal with all this stuff of life, of stressful jobs. By that stage, we had 2 kids under 3. 2020, I'm not sure if anyone remembers, COVID happened as well. Like a whole bunch of stuff happened, and it got to a point where I'm like, I've masked for so long, I need to take this mask off and breathe and just start living really authentically. And it was that moment that I'm like, you know what? I'm stepping right into this mental health space, and I'm going to be me and my authentic self. I'm going to share it. Work sucks, and I'm going to let people know about it. So, like, how can we support each other through that? And part of that was sharing my story as well.
Wow, that's so inspiring how you recognize this disease and you could like clearly articulate these points where you knew it was having an impact and you took action. I think that's so inspiring. And so tell me about Mindful Men and what's your mission and how are you helping men
Yeah.
deal with mental health?
So I guess it was born from burnout, but part of my recovery was wanting to tell my story. And so Mindful Men started as an Instagram page for me to put daily affirmations up to show men
Mhm.
that they can kind of step into this mental health space and be more positive. Interestingly, when I went back to work, I said to my manager, who was really supportive of the time, and interestingly, she said, Simon, if this happened 12 months earlier before COVID, they don't know if they could have supported me in the way that they did. So COVID made them change the way that they worked with mental health as well, because we were all working from home. They were doing daily check-ins. All of a sudden, staff well-being was important because of COVID. And it's just lucky that my burnout happened in that COVID moment. And I said to my manager, I really wouldn't want to come back to work and share what burnout is, because I know other people are struggling with stress. And surprisingly, she said, yes, that's a great idea. Let's do that, because this is part of the staff wellbeing thing now because of COVID. I'm like, yeah, cool. So I set up a presentation. It went for about an hour. And at the end of that presentation, like 95% of it was about burnout and how to manage burnout, what I did to recover from burnout. And at the end of that, I had one slide and said, I also want to share this about me. And this is coming from someone who hasn't shared this story outside of the last few months through my social media. And it's like, I'm a man, middle-aged guy from a working class family, and I've experienced mental health issues for most of my life. And it's actually making me really emotional. Think about that. And it got such a great response, right? And people would come up to me and say, Simon, I never knew that about you. Or thanks for sharing because I've been experiencing similar. Or I know someone else who's experienced similar. So thank you for sharing. And that made me feel like, you know what? That's where I've got to be. I've got to be stepping into that space more, because I see the power of sharing stories and sharing lived experience. And it was in this moment, like through working with another social worker to recover and my GP to recover as well. And they were sharing their lived experience. And it was just an interesting time, because all my therapists before that and my doctors had never shared their personal lived experience of anything. It was very closed book. It was very much, you go to a psychologist, tell them your problems, they'll tell you how to fix it, and that was it. But through this burnout, I don't know what it was, is that people, I guess it was the practitioners that I engaged. They're like, Simon, yeah, I've experienced similar. And you're not crazy. Like, it's... This is okay to feel like this. And it was that it really empowered me to take Mindful Men and turn it more from just the Instagram page. And I did what most people did around that period. I created a podcast called the Mindful Men Podcast to share my story plus similar stories as well. But it really defined how I wanted to be a social worker as well. I knew from day one that social work could be work in mental health, and that you can become this thing called an accredited mental health social worker, which I now am. And I really wanted to be what's called a lived experience therapist. I didn't want to hide behind this degree and say that I'm a social worker and I'm here to fix you. I want to say that I'm human. I've experienced similar, and it's going to be okay, and we can work through this together.
It's just amazing. I'm speechless. Like I feel honored to be in your presence and hear your story and your emotional story. So incredibly grateful for you sharing that. And I know that people hear your story. Like, I love this idea of lived experience, because if people know the struggles that you had, they can relate to those, and they're likely to reach out, say, hey, I understand how you're feeling. I feel the same way. Can you help me? And I think the timing of this is perfect, because, people who are listening to this, they're going to listen to it in the month of May. And May 1st is just in 2 days. It's a mental health awareness month. And so I think the timing of people who are in a very stressful situation, they're experiencing burnout, they're at the end of a 20-year career, or they have hit a point where they can't do it anymore. And they know that there's an underlying factor that's just exacerbating and building. And so hearing your story, I feel like will sort of be the light bulb to say, I need to make a change. Or they may be in a stressful job that they love, but there are some mental health issue that they're dealing with, and they are like, I need to get help. And so hopefully your story connects with people in a way that gets them to take action. So I appreciate it.
No, thank you. And it's weird. I don't get emotional too often, but I sit in trauma all day with the clients that I work with. But for some reason, it's the burnout story that always gets me. It always gets me, and I think it's because it was such a painful thing to go through.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also such a liberating thing to go through, to turn that pain into purpose and go, you know what, let's use this as energy for something. But as you were talking, it reminded me of this great quote that I come across in my social work studies. It was from another social worker. I think he was referencing Tony Robbins, and it's that change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. So if we stick at it, keep doing what we've been doing, and we're not getting anywhere, we get stuck. And that's the moment where we go, you know what? Yeah, it's going to be scary to go and talk to someone about my mental health, or it's going to be scary to go back to school and study something else, or it's going to be scary to quit this job and find something that aligns with me. But ultimately, that's what I need.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I appreciate it. I also looked up, why is May Mental Health Awareness Month? And this goes back hundreds of years, and it is because it's the spring, and the month of May is a time of renewal to some degree. And so I think for people who are looking for some renewal, now's the time to take action and make change. We're going to have all of your information in our notes, so people will know how to get in touch with you. Really, really appreciate you spending time today and being vulnerable and sharing your story. It's super inspiring, and there's a lot of relatable things that you shared today. So I really appreciate that.
No, thanks. Thanks for first of all reaching out and asking for me to come on. And it did take a few months to get here, but I'm so glad we did get here and have this conversation. And if it can inspire hope in just one person, and I think we've done a pretty good job in this regard. So thanks so much for having me.
Indeed. Thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Hello, everyone. It's Raymond again here. I want to take a moment and say a special thanks to our sponsor, Career Minds. They're a global provider of career transition and career development solutions. And if you like what you're hearing today, please click on the follow button and rate our show. Until next time, remember, if you're sitting there and you're stuck or just unsure of your career or future, and you really think it's time for a change, I would encourage yourself to ask these 3 questions. Does my career or work make me feel alive? And am I doing the things that genuinely matter to me most? Am I creating value for myself and for others around me? Until next time.